These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. Two women ride a four-car, an early motor tricycle with a wicker seat, around year 1902. Machines like this stood between bicycle and car and gave many people their first taste of motor travel. A cozy family snapshot shows a teen and his grandmother at dinner. The warm look comes from indoor tungsten light on consumer film. In the early 1990s, cheap point-and-shoot cameras made moments like this common in family albums. A sidewalk cage packed with cabbage sits outside a Soviet grocery in the late 1970s. Shops stored hardy crops outdoors to save space, and people bought heads for pickling and soup through the cold months. An old engraving shows a royal tutor with a prince and a stand-in boy who was disciplined when the heir broke rules. In Tudor England, no one could touch a future king, so a close friend took the penalty instead, creating a strange bond. A joint United States and Soviet Union bodybuilding exhibition in 1991 put two strength schools on one stage. The event turned sport into gentle diplomacy, with shared poses and training ideas instead of debate. A roadside egg vending machine lets people buy farm eggs at any time in 1955. These small booths showed the rise of self-service and trust-based sales in rural America, turning fresh food into a simple push-button stop. German strongman Arthur Saxon shows a daring act in the 1920s, holding a long bench of men with only his legs and hips. He was famed for the bent press, lifting 168 kilograms with one arm and stunning crowds across Europe. Paris streets turned into canals during the Great Flood of 1910, when the Seine rose over 8 meters above normal. Residents used simple boats to reach shops and homes, and watermarks from that week still remain on buildings. A moving electric sidewalk circles the Paris Exposition of 1900, a 3.5-kilometer ride with 9 stops that carried millions. Many hoped it would reshape city travel, but cost and upkeep kept the dream on fairgrounds. At a French penal colony in French Guiana, officers used an iron collar that fixed the neck and wrists to a frame. It weighed about 8 kilograms and kept the head from lowering and the hands from lifting for weeks, a practice then called humane discipline. Red Guards march in Moscow in 1917 under a banner that reads, "Communism." They head toward the Kremlin as the city shifts power in the first days of the revolution. A Kongye in Imperial China forced a person to wear a heavy wooden board in public, often about 20 kilograms, with their name and charge written on it. For days or weeks they could not use their hands and relied on passers-by for food, turning shame into a visible lesson. A German leader attends a formal reception in 1939 beside actress Olga Chekova, a niece by marriage of writer Anton Chekhov. Chekova later moved in high circles, and years after the war, rumors claimed she quietly shared information with Soviet contacts. Traveling showmen demonstrate electrotherapy machines on a western street in the 1870s, throwing bright sparks to wow the crowd. These devices gave real electric shocks and were sold as cures for aches. Vyacheslav Molotov and Joachim von Ribbentrop review an honor guard at Anhalter Station in Berlin on 12 November 1940. The visit marked tense high-level talks about strategy and influence between their states. In the early 20th century, doctors in the Russian Empire used a rotating chair for balancing therapy, believed to realign nervous fluids. Sessions sometimes went on until fainting and strong nausea, showing how medicine once trusted daring gadgets over careful evidence. A custom Queen helicopter sweeps over a sea of fans during a mid-1980s tour. Branded air hops like this moved the band between giant shows, where one night crowds could pass 100,000. A Union Army soldier could be punished by standing on a barrel with a ball and chain and a sign around his neck while the unit watched. This public shame was meant to correct behavior and was seen as mercy compared with stricter penalties used elsewhere. A 13-year-old poses for a Los Angeles police photo in 1959 after taking her mother's car for a drive. The calm look feels like a preview of a bold spirit that would later light up music and film. At the 1903 World's Fair, Edison's kinetoscope drew long lines to watch 15-second moving pictures like a dancer or a man sneezing. A single viewing cost 25 cents, about a day's pay for a worker, proving how strong the pull of early film was. Pilot Edwin King stands on his damaged Republic P-47 Thunderbolt in Italy in 1945 after a forced landing. The rugged plane often brought airmen back with heavy damage. In an Ottoman prison yard, a guard stands with a prisoner beside the kind of wooden yoke once used there, called a tata. The heavy frame locked neck and wrists for days in the sun as a public shame penalty. An American infantryman waits on a landing craft on 6 June 1944, clutching sealed gear and a letter from home. He is moments from the largest sea to land operation in history, the push that opened the road to free Western Europe. In 19th century England, public stocks held minor offenders in the town square for hours or days. Crowds often threw rotten food and mud, and exposure spread sickness more than shame. A mechanical television from the late 1920s shows a 30-line picture through a small lens, made by a spinning Nipkow disc and a neon lamp. Early sets sent thumb-sized images at about 12 frames per second over radio, a tiny start to home TV. In the Middle Ages, some false teeth were built from human teeth collected after battles. Makers also used ivory and bone, a step on the long road to modern dental care. Traveling pitchmen on the western frontier demo electric health machines that buzzed with mild battery current. They sold hope for every ache while science lagged behind, a bright spark of showmanship over proof. Women in the Kurdish highlands wear velvet coats with bright scarves and gold floral embroidery in the 1970s. In some villages, they also handled community defense and escort duties, mixing festive dress with duty. In 19th century Britain, prisons used tread wheels where inmates marched for hours to power mills or pump water, an idea patented by engineer William Cubitt in 1818. Men climbed the equivalent of thousands of steps in a day, and the devices were banned in 1902. In 1991, at Bachelor's Grove Cemetery in Illinois, a researcher's camera recorded a seated white figure on an empty stone. On snowy Hokkaido, inmates once wore a wooden kangway that fixed the neck and kept them upright, even at 30 degrees below zero. Winter nights became trials of endurance, and many collapsed from exposure. A geometry class in a girls' gymnasium in Serpukhov in 1905 shows a teacher at the board, while a matron keeps order. In the Empire, women could teach only early classes, and older grades often switched to male instructors as a mark of status. A 19th century jail portrait shows a prisoner secured by a neck collar and chain in a brick cell. Photos like this recorded restraint systems used in prisons after the Civil War and sparked early talks about humane custody. Workers in protective suits wash a car at a safety station near Chernobyl in 1986. Foam and strong water jets kept dust from leaving the zone as teams checked roads and towns for safety. At the 1878 Paris Exposition, showmen displayed electric therapy machines with glass bulbs and coils that promised relief from gout to sadness. Fashionable visitors paid many francs for sessions that sometimes caused burns and cramps. Young sellers offer Pepsi on a Moscow street in 1992 as Western drinks poured into new open markets. For many, each bottle signaled change and a first small taste of the wider world. A colonial-era photo from the Congo shows a man in heavy neck and ankle restraints beside an officer. Injuries from devices like this fueled reports that helped expose abuses and drive reform in the region. Czechoslovak AH-4 tankettes line up for delivery to Iran in 1937. These light two-man machines from CKD, armed with twin machine guns, marked an early step in Iran's move to motor forces. Clinics in Germany under the regime measured patients with tools and charts, calling it anthropometry to mark supposed traits. These records fed policies that removed rights and led to tragic outcomes for many families. Two young martial arts film stars pose casually in the early 1970s, one in a patterned shirt and one in a plain tee. Their later screen duel set new standards for fight scenes and helped carry martial arts cinema worldwide. Workers collect latex under harsh quotas in the Congo Free State in the early 1900s. Global outcry over the hardship and widespread loss of life pushed Europe to demand reforms. French sailors taste British ale in an English pub in the early 1940s. Many Free French crews were based in United Kingdom ports, where cask-conditioned beer served at cellar temperature became a shore-leave favorite. This is Robert Pershing Wadlow, the tallest man ever recorded, who grew to 2 meters 72 centimeters and weighed 199 kilograms. His clothes were custom-made, and his shoes were so large that one was longer than an average child's forearm. These Soviet labor camps used prisoners to dig canals and build railways in winter cold that could reach -40 degrees, often with almost no proper clothing or food. Historians believe that on some projects, more than half of the workers never came back. This ride was called Flying People, and in 1937 it spun visitors over Gorky Park in Moscow while they lay flat on the ends of long metal arms. There were almost no modern safety systems, just a simple frame and strong nerves. At the Paris Colonial Exhibition in 1897, people from Africa, Asia, and indigenous groups were kept in fake villages like a human zoo, eating and sleeping while visitors watched. Scientists measured their skulls and wrote pseudo-scientific texts to prove colonial rule was civilizing. Mary Bell was only 11 years old when in 1968 a British court said she was responsible for the deaths of 2 very young boys in her neighborhood. Her case shocked the country so much that she was later given lifelong legal anonymity. In some American Catholic orphanages of the 1920s, children lived under very strict discipline, long prayers and hard chores, often with little food and almost no comfort. Many former residents later spoke about deep emotional scars from those years. In the early 1900s, women with full-body tattoos like this often worked in circuses and fairs, earning more in a week than many factory workers made in a month. Each design was done by hand with a buzzing early machine. In the Dutch East Indies, chained labor crews of local workers spent up to 16 hours a day in the fields for the profit of distant trading companies. On some plantations, nearly half of the newcomers were gone by the end of the first year. One wrong spark in New York Harbor in 1942 turned the record-breaking French liner Normandy into this frozen steel whale lying on her side. Fire crews poured so much water onto the burning decks that the ship slowly rolled over. Magdalene laundries were Catholic homes for so-called fallen women where names were taken away, replaced with numbers, and days were spent in strict silence washing linen. When the last homes closed in the 1990s, investigators found unmarked burial sites on the grounds. These First World War veterans at Queen Victoria Hospital in Netley had together lost 13 of their 14 legs, yet posed in matching suits and new wheelchairs. Many men like them returned home with no long-term support or pension, relying on charity to rebuild their lives. In 19th-century religious boarding schools in Britain, boys slept in cold dormitories, ate very little, and lived under near military discipline from dawn to night. Many former pupils later said the constant fear and strict punishments followed them for the rest of their lives. These children stand in a cramped yard in Spitalfields, one of the poorest and most crowded districts of London at the end of the 19th century, warming food on a makeshift stove. In some families here, almost 1 out of 3 children never reached adulthood. Joseph Merrick, called the Elephant Man in Victorian shows, had Proteus syndrome that covered him with massive growths and made simple movement hard. After years on display, he finally found a quiet room in a London hospital, but died in his sleep at age 27. In the Vietnam War, many American soldiers used cheap local drugs to push away fear and exhaustion, and some units reported that over half their men had tried them. When they came home, doctors suddenly faced thousands of young veterans fighting a new battle, trying to break habits that began in jungle camps. On 26 May 1896, the Point Ellis Bridge in Victoria collapsed under a crowded streetcar, carrying 143 people to a holiday celebration, plunging the car into the harbor. 55 passengers were lost, and the shock pushed Canada to tighten bridge inspections. Melchor Arteaga creeps across the Urubamba River on this shaky log bridge, with Machu Picchu hidden just up the valley. In 1911, he guided Hiram Bingham to the ruins, turning a mountain known only to locals into a world icon. This man has acromegaly, a pituitary tumor that makes the body keep growing, so the hands, feet, and jaw become unusually large. Many people with this condition developed serious heart and blood vessel problems in midlife. The so-called Sacred Hairy family of Mandalay had a rare genetic condition called hypertrichosis that covered their faces and bodies with dense hair. Early generations lived at the Burmese royal court as lucky curiosities, while later relatives toured the world. In the 19th century, tuberculosis was called the romantic disease because writers and artists turned its pale, thin look into something poetic. In reality, most patients were sent to remote mountain sanatoriums, where many never returned home despite the promise of clean air. Crowds fill a New York cinema in 1939 for the premiere of The Wizard of Oz, billed as MGM's sensational new fantasy. Its bold Technicolor world of Oz later turned this movie into one of the most replayed classics on television. Von Recklinghausen disease can cover a person in hundreds of soft growths, slowly blocking sight, hearing, and movement. In the 19th century, some patients were shown on stage as medical wonders, while doctors noted how the tumors kept spreading along their nerves for life. On 24 June 1941, Nurse P.L. Tikacheva from the Brest Fortress Hospital sits among officers' wives and children while German soldiers surround the group. The battle for the fortress was almost over, but for many of these families, years of occupation and separation were only beginning. At slave auctions in Richmond, Virginia, enslaved men, women, and children sat on benches waiting to hear who would buy them next. Traders often broke families on purpose because selling each person separately brought more profit than keeping a mother, father, and children together. These are women soldiers of the Finnish Red Guard held as prisoners after the Civil War in Finland in 1918, many of them very young factory workers. Tried as rebels, they were sent to prison camps where conditions were so harsh that many never returned home. In old China, many girls had their feet tightly bound from about 4 years old, so the bones would bend and stay tiny, a sign of high beauty and status for nearly 1,000 years. Even after the practice was banned in 1912, cadet officers crouched with rifles along the Kremlin wall in 1917, trying to hold back advancing Red Guard units. Within days, this old order in Moscow collapsed, and these young men saw their world replaced by a new power. These girls are Devadasi, given to an Indian temple as children and told they now belong to the goddess, not to their own families. Behind the holy image, many were kept as lifetime temple servants for powerful patrons, a system only officially banned in 1988, yet whispered to continue in secret. East German border guards in gas masks lean over the Berlin Wall in 1988, calmly watching clouds of crowd control gas drift over a protest on the other side. Within a year, this same wall would be broken by celebrating crowds instead of standing between two armored lines. Inside this rail car, Russian peasants sit among sacks of grain, labeled Help from Lithuania, sent to the starving people of Saratov province after the failed harvests of the early 1920s. For many villages, a single wagon like this meant the first real bread in months. Under Japanese rule in Korea, captured independence activists were sometimes displayed like this before public death sentences to frighten everyone watching. At the same time, schools and laws tried to erase Korean language, names, and history. This small machine is the STR-1, a remote control robot sent onto the Chernobyl rooftop in 1986 to push radioactive debris back into the ruined reactor. The radiation was so strong that it quickly damaged many robots like this. In the chaos of the Civil War, Some armies punished desertion or broken orders with the harshest penalty carried out in front of the whole camp. The most chilling detail was that the firing line was often made up of the soldiers' own comrades. Fanny Kaplan, a socialist revolutionary, fired at Vladimir Lenin outside the Michelson factory in Moscow on 30th of August, 1918, leaving him seriously wounded. Her shots became a key excuse for a new wave of political repression in the young Soviet state. These are so-called comfort women, taken from occupied countries by the Japanese army and kept in military comfort stations under strict control. Many later testified that they were recruited by lies or force and carried those hidden scars for the rest of their lives. This stark white room is inside Kresty Prison in St. Petersburg in 1912, where women inmates slept under high barred windows and strict routines. Many were locked up for political activity in the last years of the empire. Ragged schools in Victorian Britain claimed to save street children, but many of these barefoot pupils were used as unpaid labor and fed just enough to work. In cramped dormitories and dirty yards, simple infections spread quickly. In the 1950s, Soviet streets had perfume vending machines where for 10 to 15 kopecks you could buy a single fragrant spray. For many people, it was the cheapest way to feel a little luxury in a time of shortages. 19th century asylums often used iron frames, straps, and icy baths to calm patients instead of real therapy. Doctors called it modern treatment, but many people left these rooms more broken in body and mind than when they arrived. A Chukchi woman stands at the entrance of her tent on Cape Chaplin in the 1910s, wrapped in a fur coat hand sewn from reindeer hides. Her large metal earrings and bead necklace mark status and clan, with the empty Arctic tundra starting just beyond the doorway. French colonial rule in Africa called this voluntary work, but men were forced into long shifts and paid only with small rations, often spoiled. Over decades, exhaustion, hunger, and violence in such labor systems cost the lives of millions of Africans whose names never appeared in the company records. This is the cramped glass cockpit of a German Messerschmitt Bf 110 flying over France in November 1940, with the navigator sitting behind a wall of analog dials and a giant direction finder. Soviet secret police interrogators used extreme psychological pressure like sleepless nights, tiny cells, and staged displays of future punishments to break prisoners. Many people ended up signing confessions for crimes they had never even heard of, just to make the ordeal stop. In autumn 1945, Berliners cut down park trees for firewood because the ruined city had almost no working heating or coal. Behind them, the shattered dome of the Parliament building reminds how only months earlier this place was a battlefield. These indigenous children in a Canadian residential school were taken from their families and forced to give up their own languages and traditions. Many faced hunger, cold dormitories, and lasting emotional wounds, and today, Canada officially names this system a grave injustice against Indigenous peoples. German photographer Peter Bock Schroeder shot this tractor factory in Stalingrad in 1956 during one of the first foreign film trips allowed inside the Soviet Union. His documentary, Russia Today, as we saw with our own eyes, showed Western audiences real workshops like this. Chinese immigrants in many United States cities were forced by laws and pressure to live in crowded Chinatown districts and kept from owning land in many areas. For decades, some states even banned marriage between Chinese. In 1963, these civil rights protesters quietly sat outside a southern cafe while white patrons dumped drinks and threw eggs on them for daring to challenge segregation. Images like this showing calm young people facing public humiliation instead of fighting back. These men belong to the so-called untouchable caste, forced for generations to handle waste and dead animals while others claimed religion required it. Even their shadow was once treated as polluting, so they walked separate paths. Masked women from the Irish Republican Army stand with rifles in 1971, a reminder that the conflict in Northern Ireland pulled even young women into armed underground cells. Their faces are hidden, but this image shows how everyday people on both sides were drawn into a long. These tiny coal miners in Victorian Britain worked shifts up to 16 hours, pushing heavy carts in darkness for a few pennies. Accidents with falling rock and gas explosions were so common that child deaths finally shocked lawmakers into passing the first mine safety. South Vietnamese troops test vehicle-mounted flamethrowers near the Cambodian border in November 1971, turning the field into a wall of fire before the real operation even starts. Weapons like these could project burning fuel hundreds of meters. A busy street market in colonial Asia, where vendors carefully stack brick-shaped bundles of tea, spices, and sweets, each one wrapped by hand. For these small traders, every neat pile on the table is a whole day's risk and hope. This elegant velvet-lined box is actually a United States Civil War field surgeon's kit from the 1860s, packed with a bone saw, clamps, and long probes. On chaotic battlefields, these tools had to work fast, pulling out metal fragments and trying to save lives long before modern anesthesia. These workers stand in a colonial-era work site where foreign companies took resources from the land while paying the people almost nothing. For decades, wealth flowed overseas, while villages around places like this stayed poor. This is London after the night raid of 29 December 1940, when thousands of incendiary bombs turned the city center into what reporters called the Second Great Fire of London. Through the smoke, you can see St. Paul's Cathedral still standing. Weimar Cabaret in the 1920s looked like pure nightlife and bold fashion, with performers joking about politicians, the church, and old morals right on stage. While people chased escape in halls like this, Germany was sliding through inflation and street violence. This strange three-wheeled beast is an Elgin street sweeper rolling through Barcelona in 1928, turning what was once shovel and broom work into a one-man machine job. Early city planners loved these noisy giants because they could clean whole boulevards in the time a crew of workers needed for one block. Ancient forest that took centuries to grow was wiped out in a few logging seasons, leaving only stumps and scattered trunks under the feet of workers. For many regions in Brazil, India, and Africa, scenes like this meant lost homes for local peoples. American soldiers ride through a ruined European town on a captured German assault gun, proudly marked with fresh white stars. Turning enemy armor into their own transport was both a morale boost and a sharp sign that the tide of the war had shifted. In 1859, the United States Capitol looked strangely unfinished, its old low dome gone and the new iron one just starting to rise over Washington. Within a few years, this building would sit at the center of a nation in crisis. Brokers in the Roaring Twenties crowd the street, trading shares in a fever of easy profit, while credit and risky schemes drive prices higher each day. When the market crashed in 1929, those same games erased life savings and helped pull the world into the Great Depression. A water skier glides across a quiet lake, while behind him, Mount St. Helens sends a giant ash cloud high into the sky in 1980. The eruption released more energy than several atomic tests, yet people only kilometers away were still trying to enjoy a normal weekend. A bright post-war supermarket in the 1950s shows the new promise of endless choice, frozen dinners, and colorful packaging under neon lights. Behind the cheerful signs, this was also the birth of buy now, pay later, when many families first tied their idea of success to how much they could afford to put in the cart. A glitter-covered nightclub performer grabs a quick drink in 1950s New York, while a man in the background nervously turns away. At that time, burlesque theaters walked a tightrope with city censors, using sparkle, comedy, and music to push how far a show could go. A long wall of giant faces on billboards turns this Cold War-era street into an open-air voting booth, where every passerby is silently reminded who they should support. In the 1950s and 1960s, such campaigns were less about information and more about shaping emotions. Before the Second World War, Big cities like Tokyo were full of modern girls in Western dresses and bobbed hair, inspired by jazz, cinema, and European fashion magazines. In the early 1920s, this kind of public lineup was used to shame people caught in moral scandals, like secret affairs or relationships that society did not accept. A ruined reputation was often punishment enough, and public shaming became a quiet tool for authorities. In 1972, a 16-year-old Tom Hanks stands outside his school in Oakland, just another quiet kid in jeans and a t-shirt. Within a little more than 10 years, this teenager would be leading major Hollywood films and becoming one of the most familiar faces in world cinema. In the Love Canal suburb in the 1970s, families learned their quiet street was built over thousands of buried barrels of chemical waste from an old industrial site. The health crisis and mass evacuation that followed pushed the United States to create the Superfund program. In the 1930s in the Soviet Union, gymnastic pyramids like this were staged as huge live posters of strength, discipline, and perfect coordination. The mix of leotards, rifles, and acrobatics turned sport into a choreographed message that the new state was powerful, modern, and always ready. A widow in mourning faces a room of men who will decide her future, while she herself has almost no say in the matter. In many countries up to the 20th century, laws sent a husband's property to male relatives or the state, leaving widows suddenly poor. In 1931, long after engines existed, some Dutch canal boats were still hauled by people strapped to ropes like this husband and wife team. During the hard years of the Great Depression, families sometimes earned their living by pulling heavy barges for miles along the towpaths. In the mid-20th century, huge projects and chemical use turned once rich habitats into empty fields like this, starting a silent crisis for wildlife. This forgotten photo shows how fast machines and profit can strip a living landscape down to a quiet wasteland. In 1931, firefighters and city workers in Istanbul line up beside a brand new water pumping system meant to protect the growing city. The maze of hoses and engines shows how modern machines were already reshaping daily life long before skyscrapers and highways arrived. In 1932 and 1933, Soviet authorities under Joseph Stalin seized grain from Ukrainian villages in the name of collectivization, leaving whole regions without food. The resulting famine cost millions of lives. In 1950, an engineering student proudly demonstrates his homemade robot to a crowd of curious kids and classmates. Early machines like this looked simple, but they hinted that moving, thinking devices would soon leave science fiction and enter real life. From the 1920s to the 1970s, many governments expelled entire communities in the name of security, forcing families to leave their homes with only what they could carry. Their houses and fields were taken over, and whole languages. In 1919, England, a woman tries an early protective mask created during the Spanish influenza pandemic, breathing through long tubes connected to metal filters. Odd devices like this show how people a century ago used experimental technology to guard themselves from a fast-spreading illness. In many 20th century one-party states, citizens were ordered to pack mass rallies like this so leaders could show unity and quietly see who was present. The same crowd that looked festive on posters felt like a living checklist, reminding people that the state was watching every face in the square. In 1915, rural schools in the United States and Canada still used horse-drawn school buses, like this wooden wagon, even as cities were already switching to motor vehicles. For many children, the ride to class began with caring for the horse and ended with a slow, chilly journey that feels closer to the 19th century than to our own. In many poor districts, people were offered tiny loans with kind promises of starting a business and escaping poverty. Hidden fees and interest that could reach 50 to 100% often turned those hopeful loans into endless payments that kept families stuck in place. In 1934, Soviet farm workers sit in the stubble and eat their meal right on the field, resting between long hours of harvest work. After the hard seasons of 1932 and 1933, a 12-hour day, a spoon kept in the pocket, and a rare piece of herring as a reward were normal parts of life for those who fed the country. Behind the clean walls of many mid-20th century hospitals and care homes, long rows of metal beds like these hid lives ruled by strict routines and neglect rather than real support. Patients who could not speak for themselves were often isolated, over-medicated. In the 1910s, inventors even tried turning motorcycles into amphibious machines by bolting a full wooden boat on as a sidecar. This strange hybrid promised a new kind of travel, rolling down the road one moment and sliding into the water the next. In the 1950s, Berlin children played ring games under a sign warning that they were leaving the American sector, casually crossing a line that soon would harden. Within a decade, this carefree street corner would stand in the shadow of the Berlin Wall. During the Second World War, a sailor squeezes into an empty torpedo tube with his dachshund, turning a weapon bay into a secret hideout. On cramped submarines, small dogs like this often became mascots and quiet companions during long, silent patrols. In November 1986, school children in the Gaza Strip walk to class as Israeli soldiers search a line of Palestinian men against a wall. The calm march of boys and girls with school bags beside uniforms and weapons shows how ordinary life continued in the middle of a long, unresolved conflict. On the 12th of December 1987, a U.S. Navy helicopter lifts crew members from the burning Cypriot supertanker Pivot in the southern Persian Gulf. The huge ship is covered in smoke below, while the rescue team hangs just meters above the deck in a scene that looks like a disaster movie made real. In 1858, engineers gather around an experimental telegraph set to send one of the first long-distance electrical messages. Machines like these turned dots and dashes into instant news, shrinking oceans and letting people talk across continents in minutes instead of weeks. In 1965, at Rio de Janeiro's Maracana Stadium, Pelé launches into a perfect overhead kick as thousands of fans watch in near silence. This single frozen moment helped turn his acrobatic style into a symbol of modern football around the world. In this mid-19th century studio portrait, a stern gentleman stands with his top hat in hand, dressed like any calm figure of high society. What the photo does not show is that his name would later be tied to one of the most famous duels in Russian literary history. In 1982, computer scientist Scott Fahlman suggested using a sideways smiley face made from keyboard characters to show when a message was meant as a joke. That tiny idea became the ancestor of the emojis and reaction icons we use in nearly every chat today. In 1971, a remote weapons test produced this giant cloud, photographed from 40 kilometers away along a narrow island. The plume rises so high that the land beneath it almost vanishes, showing how far Cold War powers were willing to push their technology. Two military nurses sit against an ambulance truck, calmly knitting between missions on the Italian front. Robert Capa's camera catches this quiet moment, showing how small, ordinary rituals helped people stay human in the middle of a global war. In 1870, a photographer standing with French defenders near Sedan captured this distant line of advancing Prussian troops, creating one of the first known photos of a real battle in progress. Instead of painted heroics, it shows war as it looked from the ground. In the Russian Empire around 1895 to 1905, these special railcars packed with blocks of ice carried Zhigulevskoye beer across long distances. Early refrigerated trains like this helped turn a local brewery into a drink that could reach distant cities while it still tasted freshly brewed. In November 1929 in Tottenham, England, one armed blacksmith, Patrick O'Neill, hammers metal using a custom-forged prosthetic arm built to grip his tools. His workshop shows how early prosthetics were not just medical devices, but hard-working extensions that let people keep their trade and pride. In 1930, in the Uzbek Soviet Republic, women selling embroidered skullcaps sit on the ground with their bodies hidden under heavy cloaks, while their bright tubataikas are spread out in front. In many Central Asian markets, such veiling let the craft In 1933 in Hamburg, uniformed men from the new regime carry away stacks of books labeled dangerous and unwanted. Scenes like this were the first step in cleaning out libraries and universities, replacing open debate with approved ideas only. On 1st December 1940, in Dorking, Surrey, a Home Guard sergeant calmly cleans his Thompson submachine gun at the family dinner table while his wife knits beside him. The cups of tea and quiet room hide the fact that these volunteers were preparing for the very real fear of an invasion of Britain. In December 1942, residents of Murmansk walked through streets where only bare chimneys stood after German planes dropped hundreds of thousands of bombs on the port in a single day. The city was almost wiped from the map. In 1952, the Bull Gamma 3 used about 400 glowing vacuum tubes packed into swinging racks like this and was proudly sold as a compact electronic computer. A single smartphone today quietly outperforms this entire cabinet. In 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful civil rights demonstrators were blasted by high-pressure fire hoses as they pressed against a building for cover. Images like this shocked television viewers across the country and helped push the United States toward ending legal segregation. In 1961, 24-year-old photographer Douglas Kirkland climbed and crawled around a small studio to capture Marilyn Monroe, lying under a single white sheet for Look magazine. The intimate session became one of her most famous photo series. In 1945, a group of Soviet artillerymen sit for a relaxed portrait on the grass, with the battle-scarred Brandenburg Gate behind them. Just weeks earlier, this spot had been the center of fierce fighting, and now it became a backdrop for proof that they had reached the heart of Berlin. In the 1960s, a visiting Italian film star walks through a Soviet village, surrounded by local women in headscarves. The contrast between her movie world and their everyday life turns this quiet moment into a rare meeting of two very different Europes. In 1930s or 1940s Beijing, a child rides through the snow in a homemade stroller built from a wooden crate on wheels. Simple carts like this turned whatever materials families could find into winter transport for the smallest passengers. At a mid-20th century card party, a young woman in a white dress is coached through a hand by the man standing close behind her. Around them, players clutch their cards while a woman in the background watches with folded arms, hinting that the real stakes at this table are not only money. In the early 1900s, a champion boxer poses in the ring with a tin robot-shaped prop opponent at his training camp. The playful scene was a publicity stunt, with souvenir photos sold for 10 cents and later reused to advertise boxing gloves. In 1879, a girl named Hadisi from a Moki community lies on a woven blanket, staring straight into the camera with calm, steady eyes. Her rounded side buns are a traditional hairstyle that signaled an unmarried girl, turning this portrait into a quiet record of identity and age in her village. In 1897, in Delsbo, Sweden, a bride and groom pose in heavy traditional wedding dress, with the bride covered in silver coins and embroidered jewelry. Such costumes were worn only once in a lifetime and turned the couple into walking displays of family wealth and local craft. In 1900 Persia, three blind beggars stand linked together while a barefoot boy guide holds a tray for coins or food. For many such groups, a child's eyes were their only map through crowded streets and courtyards. In early 20th century Britain, George Joseph Smith married women under false names, drained their savings, insured their lives, and each time the new bride was later found dead in a bathtub after he had warned doctors about her supposed health problems. In 1915, a tugboat tows a raft loaded with a 155mm gun and its crew toward the shore at Sed el Bahr, while big warships wait off the Gallipoli coast. This floating gun platform was part of a huge Allied effort to land heavy firepower on the narrow beaches and break through the Ottoman defenses. In the 1930s, Soviet paratroopers sit strapped along the corrugated wings and spine of a TB-3 bomber, waiting for takeoff in the icy slipstream. These early airborne troops often rode outside the plane like this because the huge bomber was packed with gear and served as a flying platform for mass jumps. On February 25, 1941, these two grim teenagers posed beside the seized rifles after a tense standoff at Echo Lake in New Jersey. In only 3 days, the 14- and 12-year-old had taken 14 cars and several hunting guns from rich lakeside homes before police cornered them in a tall building. In 1933, future French leader Charles de Gaulle sits on a beach chair holding the hands of his youngest daughter Anne, who was born with Down syndrome, and speaks to her as if the noisy world around them has disappeared. In 1941, on Gorky Street in Moscow, a trolleybus that once carried passengers now stands loaded with logs while workers unload firewood directly onto the pavement. During the first winter of war, even electric city transport was turned into timber trucks as the capital fell back on wood heat to keep homes. In 1981, the Soviet VMT Atlant roars off the runway with a giant fuel tank for the Energia launch vehicle strapped to its back like a flying pipeline. This modified bomber later hauled parts of the Buran space shuttle across the USSR, looking for all the world like an airplane giving a piggyback ride to a blimp. In the early 1920s, Albert Einstein leans on a ship's rail with his second wife Elsa, smiling as they travel to lecture in the United States. While newspapers chased him as the Wizard of Relativity, she managed his schedule, mail, and even his lost luggage so he could stay focused on physics. In 1963, a researcher in full protective gear moves racks of glass bottles holding live measles virus inside a cold storage room at a Pfizer laboratory. Work in places like this led to the first widely used measles vaccines, which would soon turn a common childhood killer into a preventable disease. On 14 February 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt met King Ibn Saud aboard the cruiser Quincy, turning the steel deck into a floating desert tent with carpets and low tables. Their private talks forged the Quincy Understanding, exchanging long-term American support. In 1938, engineers tested this bulky stratosphere suit to keep pilots alive in the thin, freezing air far above normal flight levels. Experiments with pressure suits like this laid the groundwork for the sleek spacesuits astronauts would wear a few decades later. In 1918, hundreds of captured Red Army soldiers crowd the deck of a river barge turned floating jail on the Kama near Sarapul. The Czechoslovak Legion used makeshift prisons like this while fighting its way across Russia during the chaos of the Civil War. In 1944, after liberation, French women accused of helping the occupying troops were marched through towns with shaved heads as a warning to others. These scenes of public shaming show how, even after the guns fell silent, the struggle over guilt, revenge, and dignity continued in the streets. In 1944, a U.S. Army truck races down a road near Naples, while Mount Vesuvius sends a huge column of ash into the sky, erupting just months after Allied troops landed in Italy. The volcano's ash cloud was so thick it grounded aircraft and buried villages, turning the war zone into a scene that looked almost ancient. In September 1996, young protesters in St. Petersburg stood outside Russia's first McDonald's with banners warning that burgers, cola, and candy meant a quiet cultural takeover. For them, the Golden Arches were not just a restaurant sign, but a symbol of Western consumer life, pushing into the streets of the former Soviet city. In 1944, a huge crowd gathers in a French town square to watch a woman accused of close ties with occupying soldiers have her head shaved on a wooden platform. For many, these public rituals of shame felt like a quick way to punish collaborators. But they also showed how raw and complicated victory could be. In 1918, a revolutionary food squad stands in a village yard, loading sacks of grain while the peasants watch in silence as their surplus harvest is taken for the cities and the army. For many families, these early requisitions were the first sign that the new state would decide who was rich. In 1929, Moscow, children march with banners to celebrate the launch of the AMO auto plant, which would later become the famous ZIL factory. Even school kids were drawn into the new industrial dream, learning slogans about machines and steel before they were old enough to work. In 1980s Benin, local officers stand in a rigid line beside a barefoot suspect holding evidence from a disturbed grave, turning the arrest itself into a warning photograph. Their mismatched uniforms and serious faces hint at a justice system still in transition. In 1941, this exhausted Soviet prisoner stands in a German transit camp, his shaved head and hollow face showing the cost of the first months of the invasion. Millions of soldiers were captured in such camps, and many would never see their homes again, even though the war was far from over. In 1945, young engineer Sergei Korolev stands on the broken engine parts of a German V-2 rocket in the ruins of Germany, studying a weapon that had terrified Europe just months before. Captured technology like this became his open textbook, helping him design the Soviet rockets that would later launch Sputnik and the first human into space. In 1935, this group of British coal miners emerges from underground with soot-blackened faces, bandaged eyes, and walking sticks after another shift in shafts filled with dust and flying grit. For many miners, temporary eye dressings like these were the only protection they ever received in an industry where vision often faded long before retirement. In September 1941, long chains of women in the Donetsk region dig deep anti-tank ditches by hand, turning coal country fields into a rough defensive line. While the front raced toward them, shovels and wheelbarrows became their only tools to slow metal columns they might never see. In 1927, a Soviet peasant pulls flax stalks through an iron comb to strip out the tiny seeds, using a tool that had changed little since medieval times. From these seeds came valuable oil, while the cleaned fibers behind him would be turned into linen cloth, sails, and rope that powered both village life and industry. On the 17th of February 1905, the elegant carriage of Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich stands wrecked and empty in the Moscow snow after Ivan Kalyaev's bomb shattered the quiet of the Kremlin courtyard. This single photograph turned a political attack into a visual symbol of how fragile the Russian Empire had become on the eve of revolution. On the very first day of the Moscow Metro in 1935, top party officials rode the new train like curious testers, checking how the underground city really worked. In their hands is one of the first route schemes, which only showed a single line that was planned to become the backbone of a giant future network.